Welcome to part 1 of digestion. This will be a several part video on the digestive system that you will then be tested on once you get through everything. For each video there will be a set of objectives to make sure that you've picked up what you need to, so make sure that you are taking notes. Okay, so what are we doing with digestion? Basically, we're going to break down organic molecules to their component parts. Remember, we talked about organic molecules at the beginning of the semester. They were talking things that contain carbon and hydrogen. So the key first is to break them down. That's step 1. And then part 2 is you have to absorb them. So they have to get from your digestive system into your bloodstream. If they can't, then it really is useless. Okay, it's useless to digest or break them down. So we have to break them down into small molecules so that they can be absorbed. So absorption is important. Absorption is important. The example I always use is corn. Corn on the cob. When you eat corn on the cob, we do not have the ability to break down the cellulose in the corn kernels. So what happens is you can't break them down, so you can't absorb them. So when you eat corn, you poop corn. So it looks like corn when it comes out the other end because we were not able to break it down and thus not able to absorb it. If you can't absorb it, you don't get any nutrients from it. So while corn is very good, it's not great for you because it doesn't provide you with a lot of nutrients because you can't absorb it, because we can't break it down. All right, so for purpose of digestion, we need to get the body nutrients. We need to get what it needs in order for the cells to function. So we're going to break it down so that it can be absorbed. Then what will happen is once it's absorbed into the bloodstream, it usually is going to head to the liver, and then it will travel through the bloodstream, which we'll talk about. It's going to travel through the bloodstream to get to the cells of the body to provide them with what they need. Then with the fuel nutrients, which we're going to talk about, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, those are going to be used to make energy. And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the muscles. So you're going to use the fuel nutrients to make energy. Now, other nutrients like minerals and vitamins we need in order for this process to occur, but it's the fuel nutrients that are actually going to supply the energy needed to make the ATP. So your digestive tract starts from your mouth and goes down to your anus. Now it's a lot more squiggly than this picture, but it's basically one big tube. So when you're kissing someone, you're kissing the far end of their anus. So if you don't want to kiss them, tell them you don't want to kiss the far end of their anus and they'll probably stop. It's also called the alimentary tract. Okay. Again, food in the digestive tract is useless unless we can absorb it. So what's going to happen throughout this tube is that we're going to break it down, and then especially in the small intestine, we're going to absorb it. These are the accessory organs, the liver and the pancreas. They're going to assist. Food doesn't actually go through them, but they're important for secreting things into the small intestine, especially to help digest the food. Okay, so we're going to talk about the fuel nutrients first. Again, some of this you may have had in nutrition if you've had nutrition, or if you've had a health class, you probably have talked about these. So when we talk about fuel nutrients, they supply you with energy. Calories is about energy. It's like gasoline in a car. You break down the gasoline to make energy for the car to run. You break down these fuel nutrients, they provide you with calories in order to make you run, okay, in order to have you make ATP. So that's why they are called the fuel nutrients. The first one are carbohydrates or sugars. They're comprised of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We have what are called simple sugars. These are one single molecule. Sugar is going to end in OSE. So when you see a science word that ends in OSE, you know that you are talking about a sugar. Glucose, fructose, galactose are the most common simple sugars. Glucose, candy, and so on. Fructose, fruit. Galactose you'll find in several different foods. These are the most common. So these are also called monosaccharides. Mono meaning one. So here's an example. Here's a glucose. Here's a fructose. Here is a galactose. So those are the simple sugars, one single molecule. Disaccharides are two monosaccharides together. So di meaning two. So here's an example. Sucrose. Okay, sucrose or lactose. Lactose you hear about in dairy products. Okay, so lactose is a disaccharide. It contains two sugars together. Just back real quick. In order to absorb these and use them for energy, you've got to break this disaccharide down into a monosaccharide, and then you can absorb it, Complex carbohydrates are simple sugars that are bonded together, many of them. These are called polysaccharides, poly meaning many. Starch is an example. So starch is how plants store glucose. So they take thousands of glucoses, put them together, bond them together, and then you have what is called starch. Glycogen is how we as animals store glucose, and we can store these in our muscles and our liver. So what we basically do is we eat starch. So imagine eating a potato. A potato is just a big glob of starch, Our body must digest it, break it down. It breaks down that starch molecule into its individual glucose molecules. Those are small enough that we can absorb it into our bloodstream. It goes to our liver. And then if we don't need it immediately for energy, your muscles and your liver will then put those glucoses back together again in the form of glycogen. So you may be asking, what is the difference between starch and glycogen? It's the way they're bonded together. So the starch, the glucoses are facing one direction. In glycogen, they're facing another direction. So they're similar in that they're both a bunch of glucoses, but the type of bond between the glucoses is different, and that is the difference between starch and glycogen. Starch is in plants, glycogen is in animals. We eat the starch from plants. We then can use the glucose as energy. If we don't need it immediately for energy, we then store it. In our liver and in our muscles. Again, you need to then use it as energy. Remember we talked about anaerobic, okay? To burn or make ATP anaerobically, you use glucose, okay? You use glucose. All right, so here's starch in plants. So like I said, we have enzymes, which we'll talk about, which are going to break down the individual bonds between these glucoses. This mostly will happen in your small intestine. So now we have these individual glucose molecules travel through your bloodstream, will be used by your cells to make energy, both aerobic and anaerobic. If we don't need it to make energy, then what will happen is we have enzymes in our muscles and liver that will put it back together again in a slightly different form. That form is going to be glycogen. Okay, that form is going to be glycogen. Now, if you have too much of this glycogen and you're not using it to make energy, what your body has the ability to do is turn it into fat, which kind of sucks because we really don't want fat, but that's what happens. So you want to be using this to make energy. Carbohydrates are the preferred fuel of the brain. Your brain needs glucose as a fuel. This is why your brain obviously is very important. We've talked about this with the nervous system. So when we talk about why your body, we've talked about homeostasis and maintaining proper glucose levels. The reason your body tries to really maintain glucose in a normal range is because of your brain. If it goes too low, your brain's not going to get sufficient energy. And you've probably felt this before. You're hungry, your blood glucose level may be low, you just don't have a lot of energy. And people who can't maintain proper glucose levels, like in the case of diabetes, what will happen is they can become hypoglycemic. Their glucose level can go really low, and one of the ways you can tell they're going into hypoglycemia is they may start to stutter a little bit, they can't think very well. That's because their brain's not working, and your brain can't store glucose, so it has to have it in the blood supply. So if your blood supply glucose goes down, your brain just can't make it. It can't store it. So that's why it's important that your glucose level stay within a normal range. It also can't go too high. Now, you might not feel that your blood glucose is going too high above what's normal, but it will start to, over time, over duration or years of not being able to control your glucose, if it's too high, it can actually cause damage to the nervous system. So that's why it's maintained in a very normal range by using insulin and glycogen to maintain proper homeostasis of glucose. So your brain can't efficiently use any other fuel besides glucose. Again, this is why blood sugar, maintaining proper blood sugar levels is so critical for your body. Okay. Now, your muscles can use glucose like we talked about anaerobically. It also needs it to make it aerobically. So in order for your muscles to contract, you have to have glucose there, either just to use glucose to make energy anaerobically, or to come in and use fat later on still needs glucose in order for that to happen. All right, the second fuel nutrient we're going to talk about, and just going back to carbs real quick, there are 4 calories per gram. There are 4 calories per gram of a gram of glucose has 4 calories in it. Okay, has 4 calories in it. And you can use that number to then determine how many calories you are consuming if you know how many grams of carbohydrates you are consuming. Okay. Lipids are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, have also some phosphorus and nitrogen. Fats are a type of lipid. Okay, so we talked about types of organic molecules at the beginning of the semester. Fats are a type of lipid. Now, fats get a bad rap. They're not bad. You need them. So fats are a type of lipid. Triglycerides are 95% of the fat in the body. So if you grab what's your subcutaneous fat, that fat right below your skin, 95% of that fat is triglycerides. Triglycerides are going to provide energy. They're going to provide energy. The problem is if you don't burn them to use them as energy, then they go to your subcutaneous fat, which is not a good thing. So triglycerides are made of glycerol and 3 fatty acids. That's where you get the tri. 3 fatty acids, glycerol, and then 3 fatty acids. So here's the glycerol, and here are the fatty acids. These are carbons. Okay, these are carbons, and this is the bond between the carbons. You can have single bonds between these carbons, or you can have double bonds between these carbons. Now, in order to make energy, you have to break bonds. Okay, you have to break bonds. So the more bonds that you have, the more energy you have, and the more calories that you have. So in glucose, you've got 6 bonds between carbons. Okay, so you can break those bonds and make energy. So you can get energy from that. But in lipids or fats, you've got a lot more bonds. And that means you have a lot more energy. So there's a lot more potential energy, a lot more calories in fats. So you had 4 calories in a gram of carbohydrate. You have 9 calories in a gram of fat. Okay, so that's a lot more potential energy. That's good if you use the energy. The problem is if you don't burn those calories, then they're going to store themselves as fat. Okay. So those are your fatty acids. So again, you got the bonds between the carbons. You can have single and double bonds, and I'll show you that in a second. More bonds that you have, the more energy that you have, the more potential energy, the more calories that you can get, the more ATP that you can get from that molecule. Okay. So again, you get a lot more energy than in carbohydrates because you have more bonds. You have more carbons, more bonds between those carbons, more bonds to break, more energy. Okay. Now, it's very efficient to make energy using fats, but here's a key. You have to have oxygen to burn fat, and I will show you that when we get to metabolism. But you cannot use fat as an energy unless you have oxygen present. So if there's not enough oxygen present in a cell, you cannot burn fat. Okay, you cannot burn fat. And we'll get into that later, but that's an important concept. Your heart, which we haven't talked about yet, or maybe we have, depending on what year you're listening to this. Your heart, people are surprised by this, your heart actually uses fat as a fuel. Most people think of the word heart and fat in the same sentence that it's bad. But your heart, which never stops beating, is constantly beating, needs a constant supply of energy. And so where it's going to get that energy from is actually from fat. Now, yes, you need some glucose, but you need fat. But in order for the heart to burn that fat, you have to have oxygen present. And you get that from the blood flow going through the heart. Okay, the blood flow going through the heart is supplying the heart with oxygen so it can use that fat as a fuel. When someone's having a heart attack, what happens is blood flow to the heart is cut off. They don't have oxygen. They can't use the fat, and their cells, their heart cells can't make enough energy, and then they stop beating. And when that starts to happen, then their heart does not work efficiently. Okay, does not work efficiently, and we will talk about that. Okay, so here is the fat. Let's say you eat a Big Mac. Okay, what's going to happen is, again, like with carbohydrates, you're going to use enzymes to break down this fat. Okay, so we're going to break these bonds. Okay. Then you can either use this fat as energy, okay, which is the good thing to do. But if you don't, let's say you're not burning enough energy, you're not burning enough calories, then your body's going to store it. Our body as humans is designed from when we were cave people thousands of years ago. The way we used to eat was when we were hunters and gatherers, we always didn't have access to food. So our body metabolically is designed to store energy for future use. So let's say we have a big hunt, okay? So we catch a woolly mammoth and we eat the woolly mammoth and we eat well for 3 or 4 weeks. Let's say we don't find anything. We can't hunt and it's winter, we can't find an animal. Your body is designed to say, hey, we're going to store this energy because there may be a time when we don't have access to calories. So we're going to store it, okay? We're going to store it. Now the problem is nowadays is we don't have to go hunt for a woolly mammoth because they don't exist anymore, but we just go to Walmart. So we're constantly eating. We don't have this time of starvation, but your body doesn't know that. So it keeps storing these calories for future use in case you're starving. But the problem is we're never in that starvation state, which is not a bad thing, but we're never using those calories that we have stored. But that's how our body is designed. It's designed thinking that in the future we may not have access to food, so we need to store what we're not using for future use. All right, there are 2 types of fat that we're going to talk about. One is saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fats, you'll notice all the bonds between the carbons are single bonds, okay? These are able to stack on each other, okay? These are able to stack on each other. So these are the type of fats, just to give you practical information, that are solid at room temperature, okay? So if you put butter out, it's not going to melt because it's stacked on top of each other like Legos, and so it can stay solid. If you put a steak out for a while, the fat on the steak is not going to melt. It's going to stay solid at room temperature. Now, saturated fats are not good for you. Okay, so the way to remember is sat fats are bad fats. Sat fats are bad fats. The reason they're bad for you is as they travel through your bloodstream, what they will do, they will stack on the arteries within the arteries of your body, specifically in your heart, and that can lead to heart disease because what will happen is it'll build up in those arteries, and then it will decrease blood flow. And we've talked about how a decrease in blood flow to your heart makes it harder for it to get oxygen and it can't make energy. So sat fats are bad fats. Now, butter is not necessarily terrible for you as long as you eat it in moderation. It is actually better for you than margarine, and we'll talk about that later. The second general type of fat is unsaturated fats. Now, you'll notice the difference in structure here is there are double bonds between some of these carbons. Okay? What this does is it kind of makes the fat kinky. Okay, it's got these little kinks in it. What this means is that it can't stack. It can't stack like this one. So this stays liquid at room temperature. Okay, it stays liquid at room temperature. And so it's not as likely to stack in your arteries, and so saturated fats tend to be better for you. Some fats get a bad rap. Everyone thinks fat is bad for you. And yes, large amounts of saturated fats are not good for you. Some forms of unsaturated fats, like monounsaturated fats, are actually good for you. Omega-3 fatty acids. Now these are 2 videos and you can't see them, but I'll put them up hopefully. If not, I'll show you some other ones. But this is an Eskimo and he's hunting, and a big whale's gonna pop right up there. Fish have omega-3 fatty acids, and these are a type of monounsaturated fats, and they are actually very good for you. From salmon or other types of fish, people that are on high fish diets, as long as the fish aren't eating toxic chemicals from lakes and stuff, are actually healthier. People, Inuits or native Canadians up into Alaska, they have very low risk of heart disease, even though a large portion of their diet is fat. And that's because they're having monounsaturated fats, which are actually good for you. Okay, which are actually good for you. So not all fats are created equal. We used to think fat was bad. It's not. Certain ones are. Animal fats, which are saturated fats, are not good for you, but you get into some of the monounsaturated fats. Canola oil is another one that is actually, olive oil has a lot of unsaturated fats in it, is actually good for you in moderation, okay, in moderation. All right, so we've gone over the first 2 of the 3 fuel nutrients, and the next video we will cover the last fuel nutrient, which I'm just going to let you think about what exciting nutrient could it be. You should probably be able to figure it out, but we'll talk about that in the next video.